be protected.
How do you define unthinkable? For me, unthinkable is defined by the men and women who push through non-probability and do things that are possible. The examples and stories that we see that inspire us to take action and see the greater part of ourselves. When I was 13 years old, I lived in Barrie, Ontario, and I met such a man. He was a cancer survivor with one leg, running a marathon a day across this nation for his cause. Unthinkable. A few years later, I'd meet another man who would inspire me. A man who would push his wheelchair around the circumference of this planet to raise money and awareness for his cause. Unthinkable. I think, folks, what we're talking about is the difference between possibility and probability. You see, anything is possible, but oftentimes when we cross that thin line and look at something through a probability lens, that's when human potential gets burglarized. I also think that some of the reasons why we don't step into those possibilities for ourselves is that we all have a lens in which we see ourselves through, one that may be colored with roadblocks that stop us from really doing the big things in life. Sure, there's certainly situational roadblocks out there, but there's personal roadblocks that stop us oftentimes from moving forward. I know a little bit about roadblocks. In 1989, that was a picture of me. I was one of those street kids that you see in Vancouver. I pushed a shopping cart around. I collected cans to support a drug habit. You know, if you think about it, I was probably at one of the lowest points you can be at in the Western world. You look at that and you don't see a lot of probability for success. But the possibility is always there. Now, I didn't come from this place. I actually came from a really good place. I grew up in a little town called Midland, Ontario, which is about 100 miles or 100 kilometers north of Toronto. I had a great childhood upbringing. I had a brother and a sister. I had a dog named Angus. I had a mom and dad that loved me like crazy. In fact, if you looked at my life, I was a typical middle-class Canadian kid. Life sometimes has a way of lifing us, doesn't it? Walking down the road of life and minding our own business, and adversity strikes. And oftentimes in those moments, how we define ourselves in that adversity determines whether we make that a stronger part of ourselves or whether it crushes us. Every single one of us goes through adversity, challenge, and change. In 1975, my father was 35 years old, and he passed away from a massive heart attack. And our family was devastated. Personally, it had a huge impact on me. My father was he was my hero. You know, I could do anything in his shadow. I felt loved. The man that would replace him about a year later, he wasn't much like my father at all. He was an abusive alcoholic. And so I went from this pillar of strength and love and encouragement to hearing things like, you're stupid, you're dumb, you'll never amount to anything. At the age of 9, I really didn't have the skill set to make new meaning out of that. I really internalized it, and that became a roadblock for me. And so to cope with that, I escaped into the sanctuary of drug addiction. And I started getting high for the first time when I was 9. Now, that continued for the next 15 years of my life. By the time I was 15, I was really angry. I was mad at the world. I was rebellious at home. I stopped getting along with my mom and my stepfather. I was disruptive. I was non-compliant, and I left the house. I ran away. By the time I was 16, I got in trouble with the legal system for the first time. I went to jail. By the time I was 17, I got on a Greyhound bus and went to Vancouver. And within a few short weeks, I found myself as a homeless street kid, pounding around this very neighborhood. In 1989, I'd been on the street for several years. I used to live under a viaduct not very far from here. And I used to wake up every morning and I would take my shopping cart and I would go collect cans to try and make enough money to support my habit. I was dealing with enormous roadblocks. Every morning I would wake up and I would be in some stage or another in withdrawal. And this one morning I woke up, it was the worst day and best day of my life. I got up and it was raining hard. It was late December. It was about 3 days before Christmas. And I was beginning to descend into the hell of opiate withdrawal. And the only way that I can describe that, it's like the worst flu that you've ever had in your life. But you know that $10 will make it go away. And so I went downtown and I had no money. I had but one possession left to sell. I went downtown to the park and I looked across at where the hotel was. And I waited for that hotel to open. And I went into that hotel, and sitting at the back booth were some guys I knew. The one possession that I had left to sell was a really good pair of boots. And I took those boots off my feet that morning, and I traded them. I remember the feeling of degradation and hopelessness about 5 minutes later when I got up out of that seat and I walked outside and I found myself on East Hastings in the downtown east side. I was broken. I had tears of shame streaming down my face. You know, friends, I believe that discontentment is the catalyst to change. That I believe that it's not until we're finally broken that we become teachable. That when we finally say uncle and choose to do something different, choose to act different. For the first time in my life, on that day, I became teachable. And I did something I've never done before. I asked for help. I reached out and I asked God for help. And my prayer was simple. I asked, will you please help me? I don't know how to break this cycle. I'm stuck and I need out. My best thinking has got me this far. I begged. And I made 2 promises. I said, if you help me, I promise to take the opportunity you're giving me. And I promise to work really hard to make the most of it. And then the second thing I promised is that I would do something to give back. Ladies and gentlemen, I was dealing with some pretty serious roadblocks. If you looked at my life, success wasn't probable. A week later, my mom came out and she rescued me and she took me back to Ontario. I entered into detox and then a full residential treatment. The second decent decision that I made in my life was to go back to school. I remember I entered onto the campus at Loyalist College. I looked around and thought to myself, boy, is there ever a lot of cans around here? I put my head down and began to work. I worked really hard, and after 3.5 years, I graduated with a 3.94 GPA. Those roadblocks were an illusion, friends. Those stories that I picked up, they just weren't true about who I really was. After graduating, I moved back to Vancouver. I had a relative out here, and I got set up, and my first job was in sales. And I did really well, and then I got a second job, and that job was in sales management, and I did really well in that. And then the third opportunity I got was an entrepreneur in a web development company. The year was 1998. And it absolutely exploded. In a few short years, I had had more success than I could have ever imagined in my life. In less than 12 years, I went from Skid Row to CEO. I remember some of the different accolades that came. I remember having those pinch me moments as my name and story were covered by the biggest Canadian magazines in this country. And I remember one of the greatest awards that I was given was from Coast Mental Health when they gave me the courage to come back. You know, when I think about how I actually got there, because I get asked this question all the time, Joda, how did you do it? It was through relentless action. Yes, sometimes life gives us roadblocks, but when we begin to take action, that's how we can overcome those roadblocks. But what if roadblocks continue to arise in our life? Because it's one thing to know what to do next, but it's an entirely different thing to know what to do next because you're inspired to get into it. And all day long, I've heard different stories about people's passion and commitment and being able to push all your chips into the center of the table. One of the things that I know that continues to help drive what's important to me is the things that mean the most to me. For me, that's about seeing something in everyone that's maybe not there. That promise that I made many years ago on the street has a lot to do with where I'm at now. Because when I look at kids like Cameron or Sydney, one of 65,000 kids that are homeless out in the streets of Canada today, whether it's Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver, I look at those kids and I see a tremendous possibility, and that's the thing that continues to inspire me. Last year, I was on a plane with my business partner, Dr. Sean Richardson, and we were flying into Calgary, and we both share that passion for seeing more in people. And we asked the question, what could we do to make a difference in these kids' life? What could we do to awaken the possibility in you to change the life for another? And Sean said, well, nobody's ever pushed a shopping cart across Canada. That might get their attention. And so we formed the charity, The Push for Change, and we began working relentlessly. The first thing that we did was we got a shopping cart. The next thing we said is we need to do some training. When I say we, I mean me. As I took that shopping cart, and I went to Calgary, and I began walking 24 kilometers a day, 6 days on, 1 day off. And I began walking, and I walked through Banff, and I walked through Lake Louise, and I walked through Golden and Kicking Horse Pass, and I walked over Rogers Pass, and down to Vernon, and down to Kelowna, down to Penticton, Karamias, Princeton, Hope, Mission, Port Moody, Coquitlam, Burnaby, and eventually home. I started off quiet, and it ended a little louder. It was kind of fun, too, because the police don't normally follow in front of me, they're generally behind me. I believe that we do have the power to make enormous change in the world. I believe in the power of many. I believe that 65,000 kids on the street is too many, especially when I know that inside each and every one of them is a powder keg of possibility. I believe that inside each and every one of us is the unthinkable. That each one of us, in our own way, want to step forward and provide our gift to the world. I don't think that we need to be convinced of this. What I think is we need a map to get there. And that's exactly what my business partner and I have developed. Sean wrote this formula. And I think that as each and every one of us steps into inspired action, the roadblocks fall away and the world begins to shift a little. I believe that human beings are their most beautiful when they're pouring out their lives for other people. Yeah. Unthinkable. Because in the end, the push for change is a thesis for global transformation. It's the idea that if each and every one of us were to wake up to our inner radiance, our brilliance, and were to step forward with courageous action that is inspired, we can change the world. I believe that Abraham Maslow, the great psychologist, stopped short when he theorized self-actualization, because I believe that we are on the edge of a global transformation awakening, when in the not-too-distant future, they'll call this time before. As each one of you wakes up to your unlimited possibilities and pushes forward and takes and stakes a claim on your opus work, you can and we will change the world. This is the unspeakable change that I'm pushing for. And I'm willing to cross this nation to find it. My only question is, will you help me help Sydney and Cameron?